Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar with Lauren Hayes. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled The Two Sides of Interviewing. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce today's presenter, Lauren Hayes, who is an assistant professor of instructional technology at the University of Central Missouri. Previously, she worked as an instructional and research librarian at a private college in the Kansas City metro area. And prior to working in higher education, she was employed by the National Archives and Records Administration and worked as an intern at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Her professional interests include the scholarship and teaching and learning, information literacy, digital literacy, educational technology, and academic development. Now I'll pass it to you, Lauren. Take it away.
Thank you, Bradley. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who is listening to this presentation. I'll start out by just sharing what we will cover. We're going to cover, really focus on interviewing, since that's what this presentation is titled and about. But think about specific interviews that librarians conduct. You might be engaging in reference interviewing, you likely are. And you might also be interviewing for primary research, either formally or informally, which we will discuss. So with that in mind, we are going to look at tips for conducting interviews, tips for being interviewed, and then how to feel comfortable on both sides of the interview table. So why interviews? You might be thinking, why are we discussing interviews in this presentation? Or you might be thinking, how is learning about interviewing important to my work? So as librarians, we need to gather information from users to meet various needs, whether those needs are to help a patron or a library user find the information they need, or to gather information to make the library the best possible resource for the community or organization you're supporting. Both of these types of interviews require skills and are two different sides to interviewing. So we'll talk about both sides of interviewing in this session and discuss how to be comfortable on both sides of that interview table, whether you are the interviewer or the interviewee. But first, before we jump too far into specifics, let's focus on interviewing broadly. So as mentioned, there are two types of interviews, or both sides of interviewing, as how we've framed it in this presentation. One side of conducting an interview is conducting an interview, and the other side is being interviewed. So most of us are familiar with at least one of these interview experiences. And you've likely been interviewed for a job before, and you may have interviewed somebody else for a job. That's typically how we engage in an interview process, or when we think about interviews, often it is in that getting a job or needing to interview somebody else for a job they might be applying for. But there are certainly a lot of other ways that interviews get conducted, which we'll talk about, but I think those kind of common interview experiences that many of us have can be really useful in kind of framing a discussion about interviewing from a library perspective. So when you're conducting an interview, you're gathering information, you're seeking to understand, and you're asking questions. When you're being interviewed, you're sharing information, you're seeking to be understood, and you're answering questions. So these key aspects to both sides of interviewing are important in our work as librarians, which we'll unpack more in some upcoming slides. So why participate in an interview? To further reflect on interviews, let's think about that. When you're conducting an interview, you might be searching for an employee, you might be interested in a topic, you might be gathering data, or you could be involved in research. When you're being interviewed, you might be looking for a job, which again is a common experience that many of us have. You might have expertise on a topic that you're sharing with others. Maybe you were part of an event and somebody wants to learn how that event was experienced. Or maybe you have some specific knowledge that you're trying to share with somebody else, or somebody else is trying to understand and seek out from you. So you're engaged in a process of being the interviewee. These reasons can be really helpful to keep in mind when working with others because they provide perspective on what the person may be feeling and what perspective you both bring to the interview process. So to kind of reframe that a little bit, think about that when you're conducting an interview, what is really your goal? And what is that person's goal for the session? And then when you're being interviewed, what's your goal? And what is the other person that is conducting the interview? What's their goal? And when you really have a strong understanding for both sides, have a similar understanding, you're all more likely to get the information that you need. So it's really important to be clear on why the interview is happening, what the common goals are, and how you can both work towards those common goals. Now, of course, in some interviews, you might not always want to be quite so forthcoming. There are certainly interviews that are conducted with both primary research where some of the purposes are hidden that would need to, of course, go through an IRB process. But typically, and for much of what we do as librarians, having a common goal and common understanding can be really useful when we're engaged in any sort of interview process. So let's again look at side one, which is both sides of the interviews, side one, conducting interviews. So think about these things, what is happening and why is it happening? So now that we've established some common foundational knowledge of interviews, I think we can discuss this first side in some more detail. So in a few slides, as I mentioned, we'll focus on reference interviews, but I want to discuss some general interview tips because I think they'll be useful for conducting reference interviews, which are an important part of librarians' jobs. Additionally, in your role as a librarian, you may want to informally interview someone because a lot can be learned when we ask questions and listen to others. Librarians can learn a lot about what is needed, for the library and from the library by just listening to others. So having conversations with those people in your community, the people who walk in the door, who are frequent users, just engaging in some what can really be seen as this discussion can sometimes be a way of gathering information purposefully about your library, what's needed, and then you can use some of that gathered information to make adjustments to what you're doing or plan a new event or just have some other conversations with some of your staff members potentially about directions they want to take the library or visions that your community has for the library. There can be a lot that can be gathered by just having conversations with people that can really be framed as conducting an interview, even if it is informal. So with that in mind, here are some general tips for conducting interviews. It's good to be prepared, do background research on the person. These are especially important, if you're doing some sort of formal interview. Read their work if they have any work available, whether that is a resume, whether that's something that was formally published. But to the extent possible, know who the person is. Write questions out. And then write probes, which can be follow-up questions. Probes are typically what we call follow-up questions when conducting formal interviews. Be prepared to have some of those. Give the interviewee time to share information about something that you did not ask. So this can be done just by saying, is there anything else that you would like to share? And then take time to make the other person feel comfortable. But even if you're talking to someone informally, and you want to ask them questions, it's important to consider these tips and do your best to give them time to share information that you did not ask. I think that's especially important, even if, like I said, in that informal process of having a conversation with somebody, follow up and say, is there anything else you want to share? Or did I fully, address your concerns? Or, oh, what did you think about this? I know you also attended this event, and maybe give them an opportunity or an opening to talk about something else. Do your best if you are asking them questions about an event they attended or something that they experienced in the library. Explain why. Say, hey, I'm just gathering some information. I would love your input. Or, hey, I know that you're a regular user of the library. Is there anything that you'd like to share with me? Or why are you a regular user of the library? Would you be willing to share that with me, just an informal conversation? Because I might be able to take some of what you say back to my staff so that we can encourage other people to use the library in the same way. So those are ways that you can just make the person feel comfortable, give them some context for what you're doing, and then move forward and gather the information that you need. Some of those first tips, such as being prepared, doing background research, read work, and write questions, are often conducted in more formal settings, which has an appropriate place in the library. But even in those informal ways, being prepared, knowing that you want to ask somebody questions, knowing what information you're wanting to gather, those are ways of being prepared as well. So I really tried to emphasize on the last slide about the importance of making the interviewee comfortable. And this is important no matter what type of interview you're conducting, whether it is a reference interview, whether it is a formal interview where you're, formally gathering data for something, or you're just having a conversation with somebody who walks in your door about a library event and or a library resource for that matter. And so, if it is formal, providing information ahead of time can be very useful. But if it is more of just an informal process, still saying, hey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, or I'd love to get some feedback on what you think of this tool or this resource. So you're giving them that context, you're giving them some information ahead of time before jumping in with questions. Also consider the setting of the interview. Often when we think about reference interviews, we think about them being conducted at a reference desk, but they can just as easily happen in the stacks or in another location in the building, or they could occur online. They don't even have to be face to face. They could be over chat, they could be through email. And so when you're thinking about the setting can play a big role in how you kind of build rapport with the individual. If it's in chat, make sure that you are, fully describing what is going on, asking questions, giving them plenty of time to respond, not asking too many questions in one reply, just trying to give them the information that they need and that asking the questions that you need. Because as we've all probably experienced, going back and forth in a chat can sometimes end up being frustrating. So making sure that you're asking targeted questions, but also making the individual feel heard and that you're going to meet their need, as quickly as possible. And then also make sure that you're focused. When you're working with somebody and conducting an interview, there can be all sorts of things that are going on. There are distractions, there are other things that we can need to be doing, but to the extent possible, focus on the person, right in front of you, especially if you have scheduled this event. It's just polite, and we just want to make sure that we're attentive to all of our library users to the extent possible. So I keep mentioning the reference interview. So now we are going to take our knowledge of conducting interviews and apply it to the reference interview. Just so that we're all on the same page, this is a definition of a reference interview from Wikipedia. It's a reference interview is a conversation between a librarian and a library user, usually at a reference desk, in which the librarian responds to the user's initial explanation of his or her information need by first attempting to clarify that need and then by directing the user to appropriate information resources. Library users' need must be satisfied in any case on a reference interview. So think about that definition, and let's think then about breaking that down into specific steps of the reference interview. So there are typically 5 stages. There's a welcome. You're then gathering general information about the need. You're confirming the exact question. That's really important because sometimes what we hear and may not be accurate, or the person who is seeking the information may not have clarified exactly or said it in the way that we understand. So it's always important to confirm that you understand what the information need the person has. And then intervene by giving instructions or information. So once you understand the exact information needs the individual has, you can give instructions or information to meet that need. Then kind of summarize any directions or information that you gave and ask for feedback. Say, does this meet your need? Is there anything else I can help you with? Are you able to follow up and do those things on your own? Think about how best to say that, but it's important to clarify that they feel comfortable moving forward with the information that you gave them. And the 3 final kind of steps there, the confirming the exact question, intervening, and then summarizing and asking for feedback, can sometimes repeat. That cycle can repeat, especially if when you ask for feedback, they say, well, that answers one question, but I also have another question or another need. And so then you're going to go back, gather information about the need, confirm it again, and then intervene with instructions, and then ask for feedback once more. And then potentially you might go back to answer another information need, or that might end the reference interview. But be prepared to kind of cycle through these stages a few times before a person's information need is entirely met. So, do you remember those kind of initial tips that I gave for interviews? We can use those tips in the reference interview, just modify them. So what that looks like, all right, here in the left-hand column are the general strategies, and then specific strategies for the reference interview are in the right column. So when you're thinking about being prepared, that general strategy for an interview, for a reference interview, that really can be knowing the material in your library and staying current. For a general strategy for interviews, doing background research can be making the person feel welcome. Or, reading their work, especially if you don't know the person, ask open-ended questions and do not assume. So gather information to help you meet that information need to make sure that you understand what the person is coming to the library for. For writing questions, what you want to do is listen to what the person is telling you and then paraphrase what you hear. Make sure that you understand that need. So for follow-up questions, writing those probes, almost the exact same. Ask follow-up questions. And then for giving some time to share information about something you did not ask, with the reference interview, confirm their information need was met. And then hopefully when you can make the person feel comfortable, ask them if they have any other needs. Don't just assume that you got everything straightened away, but once you answered the one need they expressed, but let them know that you are here to support other information needs that they may have. And so there are some really good tips that I'm going to go on to the next slide for as well. And so these tips are from the Ohio Library Council. So think about, the overarching goals for that reference interview. So there's a purpose, there's a deadline, a type and amount, who and where. So let's go into those in more detail. And again, these come from the Ohio Library Council. So you can find this information on their website. But why it's really important to focus in on the purpose of why the individual is coming to you is they might say that they need, material on wetlands. Let's just say wetlands. That could mean very different things though. If they're writing a formal paper on wetlands, that information need may be very different than if they are going to be visiting wetlands as part of their work. So potentially clarify, what is the purpose of the information need? How are they going to be using information? And that can help steer which direction you take a person. So with a deadline, it can be important to know, is there a date after which the information is no longer useful? So do they need it as soon as possible? Are they able to wait a bit? And, potentially you could get something for them through interlibrary loan, but realizing that might take a little bit. A deadline can also, apply to if there's a specific time frame for the request. Think about a specific date range. Do they need it from the last 5 years? Do they need historical information? Clarifying all that will be important. The type and amount, how much information is needed? Do you need 5 articles? Do you need everything you can find on a topic? What is really the need and the amount? And in what form will the information be the most useful? Is it going to be really useful in a digital format? Are videos acceptable? Do you want books, articles? All that information is important to find out in that reference interview. And then asking questions about who. And these are questions, and these are exact ones from the Ohio Library Council, but you could ask things like, how knowledgeable is the person already on this topic, and kind of gather some information about that. Ask them in a way that makes the person feel comfortable, and maybe explain why you're asking that question, a question about their own knowledge, because it can help if they need, some kind of tertiary sources that really summarize the information, or if they need primary research that is going to really dig in to some of the more detailed aspects of a topic. So that can be helpful for you to know. But if you ask that question, again, making the person feel comfortable it's going to be important by explaining the context of why that question is being asked. It could also be useful to know what information the person already has. So if they've already done a little bit of research on their own, ask them what that is. And if they have done it, ask them what that information is. And then say, did that help? Or was that information not helpful? Why or why not? And then build off of that. That can be a good way of knowing kind of a little bit more about what is needed. And then the other question from the Ohio Library Council is the person who needs the information the person with whom you're interacting, or are they seeking the information on behalf of another? And that can be really important in organizations where one person might come because to the library, especially at a special library, because their manager asked for information on a particular topic. Maybe they are the person who needs the information, but they're going to be presenting it to another group. So those types of things are important to know. And especially in special libraries, we might have a good understanding of how the organization works. And so you can provide a specific type of information that would be useful for the individual, but also the information to whom it's being presented. And then where did the person, hear about the requested information? Is it from someone else? Did they read about it in maybe a news article that they saw? Where is that information coming from can be helpful. Also can be important of why you're asking that, providing context to make them feel comfortable, that you're not just being nosy in a sense, but that can really help you get the best information for the person. And then just really understanding what prompted the question can be important to making sure that the information you provide and the directions on how that you provide are the most beneficial for the library user. So now that we've talked about the reference interview, let's talk about the second side of interviewing, which is being interviewed. We'll then connect this to conducting an interview to gather data. So being interviewed can be uncomfortable. I think that's one thing that we should all just keep in mind. And it's important to remember what it can be like to be interviewed so that you can have some empathy and make the person that you're maybe conducting an interview with feel comfortable so that they can get the information that they need. So when you think about being interviewed, what's happening? It can be you're sharing information, you're seeking to be understood, you're answering questions. And why is it happening? Often, for most of our common experience, it's not looking for a job. It's because there's expertise on a topic, you're part of an event, or have specific knowledge. So I've shared that information before, but I just wanted to repeat it here so that we're all back on the same page about what it can feel like and why interviews are conducted and why you might be interviewed. So here are some tips for being interviewed. Be prepared, know your topic, do background research, be calm, and be comfortable. Sometimes if you're engaged in an interview that was just kind of more spontaneous or informal, you might not be able to be as prepared. But what you could do is, ask questions. Why are you asking me this question? Or in what way can I be most helpful? But again, when you're thinking about these tips for being interviewed, it's really important that when you're thinking as a librarian about gathering data for somebody else, you do your best to make sure that the person you're going to be gathering information from is prepared for the interview. So giving them information about what it is that you're trying to seek out, if there's anything that they can provide specifically that would be helpful for you if you're in a more formal interview process, and then figuring out ways to help make them calm and make them comfortable. So now that we've been reminded about what it's like to be interviewed, let's apply that knowledge to conducting interviews for primary research. So why might we want to interview for primary research in a library? Because we need to understand a population, we need to understand an event, or we need to understand an experience. And an experience could be, okay, what is it like using the library? What is it, or you attended this event that the library hosted, what was your experience? Or what are the needs of the population that I serve? Those are all kind of ways of framing those pieces. And I think it's important to note that integrating interviewing into your kind of professional practice does not have to be overly formal. And I know I keep repeating about this importance of the informal nature of some interviews, but it can be just really useful, I think, in just gathering information if you kind of just ask questions, if that can just be part of your professional practice of asking questions. You can conduct informal interviews, or another way of framing it might just be asking questions, by asking your staff questions at a staff meeting and keeping those notes for future reference. It is still best practice to be prepared for informal interviews by knowing what you want to discover and then making people feel at ease sharing. The data gathered is a way to preserve the knowledge of your library, so knowledge management in a sense, but you're also capturing data about what works and sometimes what doesn't work. And that can be really useful, especially if you go back to look at those notes and see trends over time. You can know how to make adjustments and how to make your library the most successful place that it can possibly be. So when you're one thing that I always feel like I need to talk about with interviews is always ethics. And the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, is a key piece of that. And sometimes when you're conducting interviews, especially if you plan to present on any of those interviews or share the data that you're collecting outside of just kind of in an internal process, you do need to get ethics permission. So just kind of be aware of that. But when you are seeking, primary research volunteers, when you're trying to gather information from others to use, think about these key tips. We've already talked about how interviewing and being interviewed can be uncomfortable. So put them at ease by explaining the research, explaining why you're asking them to be a part of an interview, what information you're really seeking to gather, why you're asking them, like what expertise and what knowledge you think they would particularly bring to the conversation. And that can just be a way of putting the person at ease, but also always giving them a choice. To say no. Don't let them feel pressured into it. Sometimes people don't have time, or they might be uncomfortable even if after you've explained everything. So it's just really important to think about all those aspects when you're engaged in the interview process. So if you, just like we did with the reference interview, I want to think about some general strategies for interviews and then kind of compare those to specific interview strategies you can use to get the information you need from primary interviews. So be prepared and know your topic. That's really just the exact same with those specific interview strategies. You want to be clear about the topic. If you have questions already written that you want to ask, give the interviewees the questions beforehand and make sure that they're comfortable with them. Ask them if they have any questions about the questions or any feedback on the questions. And that can just help you ensure that you're going to get the best information that you possibly can. Think about how you can make the person calm and comfortable. And that is really, conducting an interview in a neutral location or somewhere where the interviewee is comfortable. So that might not be in an office where there's clearly a power dynamics of somebody sitting behind a desk. So it could just be in a conference room, or it could be, again, just wherever somebody is the most comfortable, and you can always ask where they would like. It could be on Zoom or another, meeting software. And then it's always important, and this is always emphasized in research ethics, but telling the person being interviewed that they can skip anything they do not want to discuss. So with that, I want to just give you a few resources here that I think will be helpful as you're moving through thinking about how you can use interviews in your professional practice, whether that's growing in reference interviews or gathering information for primary research. And having conversations with, again, individuals in your organization, staff members, or individuals maybe outside the community who are not frequent library users. Those are all groups that you could gather some really useful information from. So these are some resources. So I've got a few that are from the internet, but also just think about colleagues. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you just ask other librarians, other people that you potentially work with at the same organization, or librarians who work at other institutions who might have interviewing as part of their professional practice. Ask them for tips. What have they done that has worked really well? What have they done that hasn't worked well? Have they found any good material on reference interviews that they can take back to share with some new staff members? Or another thing can be pilot interviews. And again, these often occur in those more formal areas of primary research, but sometimes it can be really useful to conduct a pilot interview to make sure that if you are gathering information from a population, the questions you're asking are really eliciting the information that you want and need. So, because sometimes you could ask questions or have written questions, and then when you actually get in an interview setting with somebody, you realize that you're not getting the information that you were hoping to get. And so those questions need to be rewritten or reframed to make the interview more worthwhile and just have more depth to it. And so those initial pilot interviews can be important in that process. So those are some resources that I hope you consider and just think about as you are moving forward with interviews in your professional practice. So with that, I just want to conclude and say that to please remember there are different types of interviews that in libraries that librarians will engage in. And those are going to be reference interviews. Those are going to be interviews that are specifically geared towards gathering information in a kind of a primary research sense, or they could be informal interviews where you're still interviewing, but again, it's not a formal setting where you're sitting down and asking specific questions. You're just asking individuals and listening to them. Although very important and part of the larger kind of interviewing landscape and just knowing how to conduct interviews, make people feel comfortable is important to the work we do as information professionals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren, for the wonderful presentation. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. And please stay tuned for more content related to the series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today. And until next time, thanks.